So, Minister Barani, we're into, my goodness, I don't know if it's trying to unscramble an egg or put a genie back in the bottle, but the Online Harms Act is attempting to deal with something that I think most people will feel is probably past due and certainly very necessary, but it's tricky. And I guess in pulling together the legislation that you have, wanted to just get an idea for generally for people as to what you were thinking about, what you kind of thought was necessary versus what you discarded, the whole process of actually getting down to what was presented in the House.
Well, thanks for the question, Ken, and thanks for having me on. I think the basic idea was about ensuring Canadians have a better and more positive experience online, and that Canadians are protected when they engage online. And apropos of sort of how we were getting there, we looked at this and we thought about this for some time. We also looked very closely at what other nations had done. So we had the advantage of not being the first mover here. We're about the fifth or the sixth nation that's taken a step in this regard. And what we did is we looked at what was working and what wasn't working in places like Australia, Germany, France, the EU, Britain, Ireland. And that really helped us in terms of sort of the approach that we were taking. So I'll give you a case in point. The Germans started with this idea about a sort of a takedown model across many different areas, meaning that they identified harmful content and they required it to come down within a short period of time. They realized that that was resulting in overbreadth, too much removal of material, so they've recalibrated their entire approach. The French also had a similar approach, and it was actually struck down as unconstitutional. So we didn't pursue that approach. We identified 7 categories of material and said for 2 categories, that material does need to come down. For the other 5, you have to do what's called a moderation of risk, to reduce the harms that are potentially occurring. But the 2 categories are important, so I'll just specify those 2. That's child sexual abuse material and revenge pornography, intimate images that are shared without consent. We don't think there's any place for that in Canadian society or on the Canadian internet, so that has to come down within 24 hours.
And this probably highlights an approach that I think needs to be at least presented to people so that they understand the nature of what we're trying to accomplish here. Because some would look at any regulation of the internet and the content as saying, okay, this isn't allowed, this isn't allowed, this isn't allowed. Whereas the approach that's actually being taken is, oh, okay, this is on there right now. This is not good, and it should come off. Is that a fair representation?
I think very much so. And I think what would be useful for people to think about is how commentators are reacting to this bill. People said it's actually a pretty careful and very sort of balanced approach because it's not sort of this knee jerk, take down this material no matter what. For certain types of things that are already against the law, we're saying child sexual exploitation. You know, you represent a constituency in BC. We know what's happened very recently in BC with teens that were exposed, teens and young adolescents that were exposed to what we call sextortion. So they were basically being blackmailed for intimate images that they had shared online, thinking that they had a relationship of trust with an individual who then ended up extorting them. And for the child in Penticton, he ended up taking his life. That occurred 3 months ago. We're trying to protect kids like that by ensuring a strict response. But in the main, what we're trying to say is that for other types of content, things that might be used to bully a child, induce them to self-harm, things that incite violence, incite terrorism, or foment hatred, that material exists online. But what the platforms need to do is file a safety plan with a new digital safety commissioner, ensure that they've identified risks, taking steps to moderate risks, and report on how things are going. And that's the balancing that's really important. Another example, you asked me, your first question was about what have you learned in terms of the study that's gone on with this bill. We looked at what the Brits did. The Brits actually waded into private communication, so an individual email between Arif Virani and Ken Hardy. We do not wade into private communications. That is safeguarded from this statute. What we're talking about is user-generated content that is posted online for the whole world to see. That's caught. Private communications are not caught. Individual websites that don't host user content are also not caught. So that's where we've really calibrated it. And I think we've really gotten it to a point where we are empowering speech. And I think that's important to understand as well, Ken, because what we're trying to say is that so many Canadians participate online right now, but they're actually being cowed and intimidated and exposed to so much, it prevents them from fully participating online. That's what we don't want to see. We want Canadians to feel confident that they can participate safely in things like political debate and civic discourse online. By making the internet safer for them, we're empowering their speech.
I guess what's probably necessary here is to bring it right down into, the computer room in the individual home. Uh, and for this, we'd like to talk about the triggers. What would trigger actually the kind of activity that might then result in a platform taking something down? A parent looks over the shoulder of his kid, or their youngster comes to them, with really torn apart by what's been going on, cyberbullying, sextortion, as you mentioned, et cetera, et cetera. How does what we're designing here reach right into the home and put some tools at the disposal of parents or others to try and keep people from being harmed? What can the average individual Canadian do with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So under this new regime, if the bill that we presented becomes law, you'll have more tools and more opportunities for the individual person. So that child or their parent can flag content and indicate to the website or the online platform that they believe this content violates one of these 7 categories. So that's the first thing they could do. They could also block that user's content from appearing in their feed. So this actually gets to the point where you're actually empowering the online user. So in Ken Hardy's individual feed, you no longer need to see individual that's coming from a certain author. It also enables you, as you always could, to go to the police if something meets a criminal threshold. But what's also interesting is that the platforms, because they're filing this safety plan and they're required to try and reduce risk of being exposed to certain material, they've got to be reporting constantly to this Digital Safety Commission. If the Digital Safety Commission says, Facebook or, choose your platform, you're doing an okay job, but you need to do a better job with respect to certain types of material that is inducing a child to self-harm, etc. The commission can actually issue an order which can include a penalty against the platform. And we needed to put this in place because we needed to get the attention of the platforms. Because what I found very troubling, Ken, as just a dad of 2 boys that are 9 and 13 years old, is that right now, the only thing that's driving these platforms is the financial imperative, which is more clicks, more eyeballs on screens, which generates advertising revenue. What we're saying as a government is that we need to couple that financial imperative with a safety imperative, that keeping Canadian kids and Canadian young adults and adults safe online is equally valuable. And that's what's being added in with this legislation. So that's a critical tool that empowers the user. And the last piece, because it relates to your previous question as well, is that this is also just about basic transparency. Right now, you don't know how much understanding about how the algorithm works, what's coming into your feed, where your own posts end up. What this bill will require is for the Facebooks of the world to be more transparent with how that operates, including having access for accredited researchers to look at how things are being managed at a given platform. They would get anonymized data, but they would be able to track it and do research on what is taking place and what is not taking place, which increases the level of transparency, which is, I think, something that all Canadians are getting behind.
Inevitably, when any discussion comes up about regulating online content, it becomes a bit of a tug of war between people who are concerned about, the very obvious damage that can be done with some of the content online, and those, with a more libertarian view of the world that is quite resistant to anything that hampers free speech. And I wanted to particularly refer to something that appeared in the what was the Western Standard. So it's from Western Canada, where they do take a very much more conservative libertarian view of things. And I'll just quote from the article: "The Online Harms Act can be understood as an effort to censor political opposition by criminalizing opinions with which the government disagrees." Now, is it the case that if somebody posts something online that hurts Arif Virani or Ken Hardy's feelings, Is it in our hands then to go and require something be done?
So the answer to that is categorically no. So the first problem with what you just read from me from that article is that this isn't about governments making decisions about speech and what should come down and what should stay online. This is about taking a decision that would be taken by a court ultimately. So the first point is that Facebook makes a determination. That determination is vetted by the Digital Safety Commissioner. The Digital Safety Commissioner's decision is vetted by a court of law. So it's not government that's deciding, it's our courts that are deciding. Secondly, what are they deciding about? They're deciding about what meets the definition of hatred, which begs the question, whose definition of hatred are we using? Is it Ken Hardy's definition? Is it Arif Irani's? Is it Justin Trudeau's? It is none of those. It is a definition of hatred that comes out of Supreme Court cases that have already been decided, out of Supreme Court case law. That definition comes from a case called Keegstra and a case called Whatcott. And in that case, the courts have said that we will apply a definition of hatred means detestation and vilification. It does not mean things that are hurtful, offensive, or insulting, or expressions of disdain or dislike. What I've said in more slang terms is that everything out there that is awful is still lawful. So people that are making off-color jokes, that are insulting people in communities, that is still completely protected and will remain protected. That's important. What isn't protected is calling for the extermination of a group of people, right? That's really, really fundamental. And what I would say, Ken, in terms of this last idea about promoting speech, is that it's really, really critical for people to understand that right now there is hatred that is defined by courts that is already not legal, right? So what I find puzzling by this criticism is that people presume that there is unbridled free speech in Canada. There is not. Physically in Canada, you cannot advocate genocide, publicly incite hatred, or willfully promote hatred, or deny the Holocaust. That is in our legislation right now. All we are saying is that if hate speech is not protected speech in the physical world, hate speech should not be protected speech in the online world. We're just trying to cure the asymmetry that exists right now. That's really, really important for people to understand.
There has been some commentary on the penalties that the legislation proposes, and it does appear to be quite stiff. And it's my understanding, reading the various commentaries on it, that the penalties not only can apply to the platform, but also apply to the person who actually posted the material that is deemed to be offensive in one form or another. I guess, what would you say to the people that say that this is maybe a little too heavy-handed?
I'd say to you that I think we should all reflect on where we are in terms of hatred in Canadian society. I think people need to understand that online harms have real world consequences. If you need some cases in point, look at the individual who shot 6 people at the Quebec City Mosque in 2017. In court, he admitted to being radicalized online. The individual who used a van to attack 4 members of the Uzzel family in London, Ontario, admitted in court to being radicalized online. So not addressing online safety actually prevents safety in the physical world and creates dangers in the physical world. That's an important point. There are consequences for both platforms and for individual posters, but they are in different parts of the legislation. So the penalties on an online platform can go as high as 6% or 8% of global revenue, or as high as $25 million, whichever is higher. That's important to get the attention of these platforms. But there are penalties of as much as $20,000 as a penalty under the Canadian Human Rights Act for an established case of discrimination on the basis of promoting online hate speech for an individual poster. That is important as a $20,000 penalty that will have an impact on that individual's behavior. But again, what I would say to you is that the statistics are alarming in terms of the rise of hatred we've seen against various groups in this country, particularly in the last 6 or 7 months, given geopolitical conflicts that are raging elsewhere. In my own city of Toronto, hate crimes are up 93% since October 7th. And those are statistics that have been provided by the Toronto Police Service. And the last thing I would say is that people also need to reflect on what is the motivation behind people who are intimidating others online. And if you actually pierce into it, this is when you see that it has nothing to do with the nature of the political speech, etc. Prime Minister Meloni of Italy is the head of a G7 country. She is being targeted by artificially intelligence created deep fakes, so much so that she's now in litigation against those who have put out those deep fakes against her. It is not only problematic what's being done to Prime Minister Meloni, but the reason for which it is being done. It is being done specifically because she is trying to exert her political speech in a public forum, namely the Parliament of Italy. This is an elected leader of a G7 country who is, people are attempting to cower and stifle her ability to do her job and participate in public discourse. And you see this again and again and again, very frequently with female leaders in various countries, including our own. That kind of behavior needs to be curbed. And by addressing deep fakes in the context of revenge porn, which is what this legislation does, and by addressing those that would foment hatred, what we're doing is ensuring that people who want to participate publicly, including in political discourse, are able to do so. And that's fundamental for all of us.
One of the things that's been brought up, which I suppose is a criticism of the legislation for not going far enough, is the impact and the use of the algorithms that basically give you what you like, but not necessarily what you need. I was given an example of a deep fake involving Prime Minister Trudeau, where he is very realistically looking at promoting some particular product or investment, in a speech that he was making. And somebody who views that will get more material like that, but the algorithm won't necessarily provide them with an alternate point of view, or even a flag that, hey, this has been manipulated. This is not something that the Prime Minister said, or the Prime Minister of Italy, or any other public figure, or any figure, period, a movie star, et cetera, et cetera. But the legislation that we're talking about doesn't dive into the black pool of algorithms, does it?
Well, it's a bit gray, Ken. So what I would say to you on that is that it does address deep fakes. We put that language directly into the legislation in the context of revenge porn, those who would share intimate images that without consent. If those intimate images are artificially created, that's captured. It does also look at the need, for example, and places an active duty on platforms to identify inauthentic robotic communications. So if you were getting inundated with material and it's coming from an automated source that is illegitimate, the online platform has to now declare that and inform you of that, so you can exercise your own decision-making about how much credibility you want to give to that information. The third thing I would say to you is that because you're allowed to curate your own experience in a more direct manner by both flagging and signaling, so you flag to the platform that this material is offside, you block that user's material from coming onto your feed, you start to have the power to start to curate your own online experience. So you're actively changing your own algorithm. And fourthly, I'd go back to what I said earlier, which is that the Digital Safety Commissioner has the ability to accredit researchers at UBC or SFU in your context who might want to do a deep dive into how things are operating in terms of preventing cyberbullying of children, how Facebook is doing in that regard. They will get anonymized data that is scrubbed of personal identifying characteristics, but they will be able to learn and ascertain how aggressively Facebook is taking on that issue. So we're starting to get into it more, but I think ultimately it's a good question, and it's one of the reasons why this bill needs to go into second reading debate and get to committee so that we can really tease out these conversations and really probe what more needs to be done. I'll tell you another thing that needs to be done. I mean, Amanda Todd is a case that's very familiar to people in your part of the country. People have said to me that, well, shouldn't we just use the criminal code to deal with everything? What I'd say to you is that please go talk to Carol, Amanda's mother. Amanda Todd is no longer with us. That was an absolute horrific tragedy. Amanda's predator also has already been prosecuted. That happened years ago. But Amanda's victimization continues to this day posthumously. Why? Because the images of Amanda's naked body continue to circulate online. Until we actually get rid of that component and remove that content from the internet domain, her re-victimization and victimization of others like her will continue unabated. That's what this legislation will do by forcing platforms to just take down child sexual exploited material and material that includes revenge porn. That's why Carol Todd has been so vociferous in her support of it. That's why I'm behind it as a parent and as a parliamentarian.
And they can do it. I have a personal example. Starting in late 2015, I started up a private Facebook page where I basically curated various news coverage that approached things in what I thought was a very useful way. And in one fell swoop, Meta erased 8 years of material that I had posited on this private Facebook page only by invitation. So there's no doubt they can do that. There's also no doubt that they could adjust their algorithms so that if you read something that sounds like a conspiracy theory, something would pop up and say, hey, here's another view of this that maybe you should look at before you come to your own conclusion. This can all be done, but so far the platforms aren't necessarily willing to do it.
And this is about changing the responsibilities on the platform, because you're absolutely right, Ken. So we would have a duty to protect, a duty to act responsibly, and a duty to remove certain content, such as the child sex material and the revenge porn that I just mentioned. Those duties also are commensurate with what we're seeing elsewhere. So I think the tide has turned on the internet as we've seen it thus far, because France has moved, Germany has moved, Australia, Britain. What's also really interesting is that people say to me, it seems like a bit of a partisan divide. What I gently point out is that that is a conservative government in Britain that in the last 14 months waded into this area in an even more aggressive manner than we are proposing. This is not partisan. It should never be partisan. Canadians deserve safety in terms of their online engagements, and children deserve to be protected. That's got to be fundamental for all of us because it produces a safer citizenry that is able to engage more readily, which is critical.
Well, I think that inevitably this is going to distill itself down into what happens inside people's homes. We hear, for instance, there's a measles outbreak across Canada. And part of the reason for that is attributed to the algorithms online that have been feeding young mums conspiracy theories about vaccinations. And some people are saying that that's leading to moms not getting their kids vaccinated, which allows measles, which is highly contagious, to run rampant in some parts of the Western world, including Canada. And that gets down to the assist that we need to provide to parents. I think our colleague Todd from Prince George, when he was talking about the young fellow who in 12 hours was driven to the point of committing suicide, Todd Doherty mentioned that, it is partially up to parents to deal with this. So what can we do to empower parents, particularly their abilities under the new legislation or whatever version of it emerges through the debates, et cetera? What can we do to really impress upon them that we can make as many laws as we like, but it's still going to take some deliberate action on the home front to keep the kids safe?
Well, I think it's twofold, right, Ken? So I think there's no doubt that parents and families have a role to play here. We want to have candid conversations between particularly children and parents in the context of a child that might be suffering extortion or sextortion, as the case may be. I think there's an aspect of the legislation that talks about digital literacy and boosting that digital literacy so people are more critical with what they're looking at. We are proposing to create a digital ombudsperson office. So there's a safety commissioner and an ombudsperson. That ombudsperson is kind of like a concierge and acts as a sort of a resource or referral mechanism so people understand what their rights are, where they can go for certain remedies. But I also put it to you that, you talked about sort of parents in BC, parents in Ontario. We all have the same goals for our kids, which is fundamentally about keeping them safe. But what's really, really critical here is that, Ken, all of us that are raising children, we all do certain basic things, such as teaching a child how to cross the road, look left, look right. But we understand that there are also rules of the road. There are stop signs and red lights where cars are supposed to stop. There are speed limits. What we can do is we can try our best to empower a kid to take that step from a flip phone to a smartphone to engaging online, etc. But if there aren't rules in terms of the internet, then every effort we take will be for naught. And what we're trying to do is ensure that we are creating those rules that promote safety, such as something as basic as a duty to protect children, a duty to put in place age-appropriate design features. There's no reason why you can't have an internet chat room that is only available to young people. But right now, your and my kids or grandkids can be preyed upon by somebody who's pretending to be a Fortnite video game player, and you think you're dealing with another 12-year-old, but they're in London, England, not London, Ontario, and that person's actually masquerading as a 12-year-old, and it's a 55-year-old man 5,000 kilometers from here who's going to sort of lure you in, befriend you, get you to share images. How big are your muscles? How big is your genitalia? You share an image, and in 4 seconds, you're being extorted for $200, $400, $600. So shamed that you can't admit this to anyone that you end up harming yourself or maybe even taking your own life. This sounds fantastical. It is happening all of the time. The Canadian Centre for Child Protection is getting 70 calls per week from Canadian kids caught in this very situation. And those are the only cases, those are only the cases that are coming forward. There's probably many more that don't come forward. So that's what we're trying to get at here. It's about empowering parents, but also creating rules online to protect our children.
I guess the final point that I would like to bring up actually were the points that were made by Frances Haugen, the former Meta employee, who blew the whistle, basically saying Meta had the capability to make online activities much safer, but had so far declined to do so. And she was also very complimentary, by the way, of the legislation that you tabled in the House of Commons. And very clearly, as you said, it's going to go through debate. There could be some amendments, either by Parliament or by the Senate. And this is hopefully all a very good iterative process to coming up with the best we can possibly do. But what kind of reaction have you received from the platforms themselves? I mean, they're the ones that are, on the one hand, going to be under the gun, but they're the other, that should be facing a lot more public scrutiny for what they've allowed to happen so far.
Well, Ken, you put out there the idea about a $25 million fine that might touch 8% of global revenue. You're trying to get the platform's attention, but I've been actually pleasantly surprised by the reaction we've gotten so far. They have reached out to my office and they're willing to do the work to make improvements in an area that I think they recognize needs improvements. It's not lost upon me that the U.S. Surgeon General was at the forefront of the battle against cancer-causing tobacco in the 1960s. The same U.S. Surgeon General's office has indicated that social media is causing a mental health crisis amongst American youth. The exact same could be said for Canadian youth. I think what Frances Haugen is identifying here is potentially best-in-class legislation that really calibrates the importance of free speech and promoting that in any democracy, as one absolutely has to do, as I absolutely would always do as a person who's sworn to uphold the Constitution and our Charter, but at the same time exposing more transparency and accountability on the part of these platforms that are only motivated by clicks and eyeballs on screens and advertising revenue, and coupling it with the safety piece. I think that's really, really important. The other thing, Ken, I would say to you is that police have also told me repeatedly that when it comes to keeping kids safe, keeping adolescents safe, keeping adults safe, they are stretched and they can't do everything that they need to do because they need some tools that relate to the images themselves. So again, going back to Amanda Todd, right, you can prosecute people, and the issue for most of those people, even when it's still happening, is that all they want is for the image to come down. If we create this legislation, if we implement it, we'll have a requirement that says child sexual exploitation material and revenge porn has to come down. And that's what the victims need. And supporting victims in this way is something that I think all of us need to get behind and support.
We will look forward to the debates. We'll look forward to seeing what emerges. And particularly once we know precisely what this law is going to look like, then I think we need to mobilize every last legislator, every last parliamentarian in the country to empower the folks at home to, do their part, because that's really, to use the old expression, that's where the rubber hits the road here. And we need to put the tools in everybody's hands to stop the kind of tragedies we've seen so far. Minister Virani, I really appreciate your time. Appreciate this very much. Good luck with this.
Thank you very much, Ken. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing it in Parliament as well, because after 4 years of consultation, I think we've got a strong bill. I don't purport to have a perfect bill. I want to see it go through Parliament and go through committees so we can make it even stronger. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.